Rome, in the year 236 BC, still bore the scars of a war that had tested the young republic as nothing before it had. The First Punic War had ended just 5 years earlier, its conclusion leaving Carthage diminished but not destroyed, its navy shattered but its ambitions intact. Roman mothers still whispered of the years when fleets had foundered in Mediterranean storms, and legions had bled across Sicilian hills. Yet the city itself hummed with the energy of a power discovering its own strength, its temples rising in fresh marble, its streets crowded with citizens who had learned that Rome could challenge even the masters of the sea. Into this world of veteran soldiers and widowed households, of triumph songs still echoing and wounds not yet fully healed, a child was born to one of the Republic's most distinguished families. The Cornelii Scipiones traced their lineage through generations of service that had shaped Roman history, their name appearing again and again in the lists of consuls and commanders who had carried the eagles against Rome's enemies. The gens, Cornelia itself, stood among the most ancient of patrician clans, but the Scipio branch had earned particular distinction through military excellence that each generation seemed determined to surpass. Publius Cornelius Scipio entered the world carrying expectations that would have crushed lesser spirits. His father, also named Publius Cornelius Scipio, had already begun the career of public service that would eventually lead him to the consulship and command of armies. His uncle, Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Calvus, walked the same path of honours and responsibilities that the family had worn smooth through centuries of ambition and achievement. The infant who bore their name would be expected to match or exceed accomplishments that most Roman families could only admire from a distance. His mother, Pomponia, brought her own connections to the household, her presence ensuring that the boy would grow up surrounded by the networks of alliance and obligation that governed Roman political life. A brother named Lucius would eventually share his childhood, the two sons representing the family's investment in a future that Roman aristocrats planned with the same care they applied to military campaigns. Every marriage, every friendship, every gesture of hospitality or support served purposes that extended far beyond the immediate moment. The household where young Publius took his first steps functioned according to rhythms that military service had established over generations. His father's absences on campaign punctuated domestic life with intervals of anticipation and relief. The returning commander bringing tales of distant frontiers that filled a child's imagination with images of peoples and places beyond the Italian hills. Servants who had followed Scipio banners into battle moved through corridors where war trophies decorated walls and ancestral masks watched from their shrines with painted eyes that seemed to measure each new generation against the standards of the old. Education began early for sons of such houses, their training designed to produce men capable of commanding legions and governing provinces before they reached ages that other societies would consider barely adult. Tutors drilled young Publius in the Greek that educated Romans considered essential. His lessons drawn from historians and philosophers whose works illuminated the principles that should guide men entrusted with power over others. Yet his Greek would always remain functional rather than elegant, the practical concerns of his upbringing leaving little time for the literary refinements that more leisured aristocracies might cultivate. The Campus Martius stretched beyond the old city walls, its broad expanse serving as the training ground where Roman youth learned the arts of war, that their civilization had elevated to something approaching religion. Young Publius watched soldiers drill in formations that had proven their worth across generations of conflict, their movements as precise as religious ritual and considerably more practical. The officers who commanded these exercises bore scars that testified to lessons learned in places where mistakes meant death rather than merely disappointment. Religion wove through daily life with an intimacy that later ages would find difficult to comprehend. The gods received their due at household shrines each morning, their favor sought through offerings and observances that varied little from those the boy's ancestors had performed centuries before. Yet young Publius developed a relationship with the divine that his contemporaries found somewhat unusual, a sense of personal connection to Jupiter and the protecting deities that would later manifest in behaviors that some considered dangerously close to claims of special favor. The rhythms of the Roman calendar carried the boy through childhood years that blended privilege with preparation. Religious festivals marked the passing seasons, while political assemblies demonstrated the mechanisms through which the Republic governed itself. Triumphs celebrating victorious commanders paraded through streets where young Publius stood among the crowds, watching prisoners and spoils pass by, while citizens cheered achievements that might someday be his own to claim. His father's career advanced through the cursus honorum, the sequence of offices that ambitious Romans climbed like steps toward the consulship that crowned successful public lives. Each advancement brought new responsibilities, new absences, new stories of challenges met and obstacles overcome. The son absorbed these experiences as models for the life he would be expected to lead, understanding from his earliest years that personal glory and public service were not merely compatible, but inseparable in the world his family inhabited. The great families of Rome existed in constant competition, their rivalries conducted through elections and legislation, through marriages and military commands, through every mechanism the Republic provided for channeling ambition into forms that strengthened rather than destroyed the state. Young Publius learned to navigate these currents before he fully understood their depths, his family's alliances and enmities becoming as familiar as the layout of their house or the faces of their servants. Carthage remained a presence in Roman consciousness that even children could not escape. The peace that had ended the First Punic War had stripped the African city of its Sicilian possessions and burdened it with indemnities that would take decades to discharge. But Carthage itself remained wealthy, capable, and resentful. Traders who had dealt with Carthaginian merchants brought reports of a city rebuilding its strength, its governing councils divided between those who counseled acceptance of diminished status and those who dreamed of reversing the verdicts that Roman arms had imposed. The name of Hamilcar Barca circulated through Roman awareness like smoke from distant fires. This Carthaginian general had fought the Romans with a ferocity that peace had not extinguished, his reputation suggesting that the war's end had not resolved the conflicts underlying it, but merely postponed their continuation. Reports placed him in Spain, carving out territories that might someday provide the resources for renewed challenge to Roman power. His son, Hannibal, Romans heard, had sworn eternal hatred of their city before he was old enough to understand what such oaths meant. Young Publius would have absorbed these reports as part of the background noise of Roman political life, their significance becoming clearer as his education progressed and his understanding of the world beyond Italy's shores deepened. The Mediterranean that Roman galleys now dominated stretched toward horizons where other powers nursed grievances and prepared responses that the victors of the First Punic War might not anticipate. The peace that had seemed so conclusive was proving to be merely an intermission. The years of childhood passed in the patterns that aristocratic Roman life had established, each stage bringing new expectations and new preparations for the responsibilities that adulthood would impose. Young Publius grew in an environment where martial virtue ranked above all other qualities, where the stories that mattered most concerned battles won and enemies overcome, where even the games children played prepared them for the serious business of commanding men in war. His father received the consulship for the year 218 BC, the highest regular magistracy the Republic offered, its attainment marking the culmination of ambitions that generations of Scipiones had cultivated. The honor carried responsibilities that would soon prove heavier than anyone anticipated, for the news filtering across the Mediterranean suggested that the intermission was ending. Hannibal Barca, Hamilcar's son, had grown to manhood in the Spanish territories his father had conquered, his armies swelling with warriors whose loyalty he had earned through years of shared campaigns. The siege of Saguntum reached Rome as the first clear indication that Carthage's patience had exhausted itself. This Spanish city had allied itself with Rome, its position below the Ebro River placing it within the sphere that treaties had reserved for Carthaginian influence. Hannibal's decision to besiege it, despite Roman protests, announced that the accommodations of the previous decades no longer satisfied Carthaginian ambitions. War was coming, though few in Rome could imagine the form it would take. Young Publius had reached the threshold of manhood when the news arrived that shattered all assumptions about how the coming conflict would unfold. Hannibal had not waited for Roman forces to carry the war to Spain or Africa as the previous generation had carried it to Sicily. He had done something that Roman strategists had considered impossible. He had marched his army, elephants and all, across the Pyrenees, through the hostile tribes of Gaul, and over the Alps themselves in a feat of audacity that rewrote the rules of Mediterranean warfare. The enemy was in Italy. The enemy was marching toward Rome through territories that had never seen Carthaginian soldiers, his veterans descending from frozen passes into the fertile plains of the Po Valley, where Celtic tribes nursed their own grievances against Roman expansion. Everything young Publius had learned about war, about strategy, about the orderly progression of Roman campaigns against distant enemies. All of it suddenly seemed inadequate to a situation that no one had anticipated and no one knew how to address. His father would march north to meet this threat, the consular armies assembling for a confrontation that everyone expected would teach the audacious Carthaginian the limits of his gamble. Young Publius, not yet 18, would accompany the expedition in a capacity appropriate to his age and inexperience, his education about to continue in classrooms where the lessons were written in blood and the examinations offered no second chances. The household gods received their offerings as the Scipio men prepared for departure, the ancient rituals unchanged despite circumstances that had no precedent in Roman experience. The boy who had grown up hearing tales of his ancestors' achievements now faced the prospect of adding his own chapters to a family history that demanded excellence as the price of membership. Whatever happened in the coming months, nothing would ever be the same. Not for Rome, not for the Mediterranean world, and not for the young man riding north beside his father, toward a destiny that neither of them could possibly foresee. The Alps had disgorged an army that would haunt Roman nightmares for a generation. The campaigns that followed would demand everything the Republic could give, and more than many thought it possessed. And young Publius Cornelius Scipio, heir to a house of heroes, was riding toward the first of many appointments, with a fate that history was already preparing to make legendary. The Po Valley spread before the Roman forces in late autumn of 218 BC, its broad plains already touched by the chill that would deepen as winter approached. Mist rose from rivers whose names would soon become synonymous with disaster, their waters reflecting skies heavy with clouds that seemed to press down upon a landscape about to witness the collision of two civilizations. Young Scipio rode among his father's staff, his eyes taking in terrain that looked nothing like the training grounds where he had learned the theory of warfare. Hannibal's army had descended from the mountains gaunt and diminished but unbroken, the survivors of that impossible crossing, harder than the rocks they had climbed, and more determined than the snows that had buried so many of their comrades. The Carthaginian had lost nearly half his force to the Alps, yet what remained represented a concentration of veteran soldiers whose experience exceeded anything the hastily assembled Roman legions could match. Gallic tribes, nursing generations of resentment against Roman expansion, flocked to his standards with enthusiasm that multiplied his numbers daily. The Ticinus River carved its path through flatlands, where cavalry could operate with the freedom that infantry formations denied them. Here the consul Scipio led his horsemen forward to reconnoiter enemy positions, his son accompanying the patrol in a role that combined education with genuine military purpose. The morning fog that clung to the riverbanks obscured distances and muffled sounds, transforming the familiar landscape into something uncertain and vaguely threatening. Contact came with the sudden violence that characterized encounters between screening forces, Numidian cavalry emerging from the mist, with a speed that Roman horses could not match. The engagement that followed swirled across ground that offered no advantages to either side, its chaos providing young Scipio's first experience of combat's reality. The noise, the confusion, the way time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, the absolute necessity of acting, despite incomplete information and overwhelming fear. His father fell wounded in the melee, the consul's horse going down and leaving him exposed to enemies who recognized the value of such a prize. What happened next would define young Scipio's reputation for the rest of his life, though accounts would vary in their details while agreeing on the essential fact. The 17-year-old charged toward his fallen father through enemies who should have overwhelmed him, his intervention buying the moments necessary for other Romans to reach the consul and extract him from the killing ground. The wound that the elder Scipio carried from Ticinus would heal, but the engagement itself announced patterns that would repeat with terrible consistency over the coming years. Hannibal's cavalry superiority, his soldiers' experience, his own genius for reading terrain and exploiting weakness. These advantages would prove decisive in battle after battle, while Roman commanders struggled to find responses that their training had not prepared them to devise. The Trebia followed weeks later, its icy waters running red with Roman blood, as Hannibal demonstrated the tactical sophistication that would make him legend. The consul Sempronius, eager for battle, despite his colleagues' wounds and warnings, led his legions into a trap so perfectly constructed that later generations would study it as a model of the military art. Roman soldiers who had crossed the freezing river without breakfast found themselves surrounded by enemies who had rested and eaten, their strength draining away in combat that offered no path to victory. Young Scipio survived the disaster that consumed so many of his countrymen, his experience at the Trebia adding darker lessons to those that Ticinus had begun teaching. He watched the Roman center hold with the stubborn courage that legionaries would display throughout the war, their discipline preserving formations even as cavalry swept away their flanks and hidden forces emerged to complete their encirclement. 10,000 Romans cut their way through the Carthaginian line that day, their escape a testament to valor that defeat could not diminish. Winter brought pause, but not peace, the season's hardships falling more heavily on Hannibal's army than on Romans who could draw supplies from territories they controlled. Yet spring would bring renewed catastrophe, as the Carthaginian demonstrated that his crossing of the Alps had been merely the first of many impossibilities he would accomplish. The route he chose into central Italy led through marshes that Roman commanders had considered impassable, his army wading for days through waters that cost him an eye to infection, but delivered him into positions that outflanked every defensive arrangement Rome had prepared. Lake Trasimene provided the setting for slaughter that exceeded anything the Ticinus or Trebia had witnessed. The consul Flaminius led his legions along the narrow shore road without adequate reconnaissance, his columns stretching into a defile where hills on one side and water on the other offered no escape when Hannibal's forces descended from concealed positions in the morning fog. 15,000 Romans died in hours, their bodies choking streams and washing against shores where fishermen would find equipment and remains for years afterward. Rome itself trembled at news that seemed to worsen with each messenger's arrival. The city had not faced such danger since the Gauls had sacked it nearly 2 centuries before, that ancient catastrophe suddenly feeling less distant as Hannibal's army marched through Italian landscapes that no foreign enemy had traversed in living memory. The Senate appointed a dictator, reviving emergency powers that the Republic employed only when normal governance proved inadequate to extraordinary threats. Fabius Maximus received the dictatorship with a strategy that prioritized survival over glory. He would shadow Hannibal's movements without offering the pitched battle that the Carthaginians sought, wearing down the invaders through attrition while denying them the decisive victory that might detach Rome's Italian allies from their allegiance. The approach required patience that Roman pride found difficult to sustain, its apparent passivity earning Fabius the nickname Delayer from critics who considered caution indistinguishable from cowardice. Young Scipio observed these strategic debates while continuing his military education through service that each campaign made more demanding. He had proven his courage at the Ticinus, his resilience through the disasters that followed, his capacity to learn from defeats that would have broken spirits less determined than his own. The officers who commanded him recognized qualities that transcended the advantages his family name provided, their assessments contributing to a reputation that grew even as Rome's military fortunes declined. The year 216 BC brought new consuls and renewed determination to force the confrontation that Fabius had avoided. Hannibal had wintered in southern Italy, his army refreshed and reinforced by Gallic recruits whose hatred of Rome matched his own. The largest army Rome had ever assembled, 8 legions and equivalent allied forces, perhaps 80,000 men, marched south under consuls whose confidence exceeded their competence. Young Scipio served among them as a military tribune, his rank reflecting both family influence and demonstrated capability. Cannae waited in the Apulian plain, its name destined to become synonymous with military catastrophe, so complete that future commanders would use it as shorthand for annihilation. The Roman army that deployed across that dusty ground on an August morning believed that sheer numbers would overwhelm an enemy who had won previous victories through cleverness rather than strength. By nightfall, that army had largely ceased to exist, its remnants scattered across a landscape carpeted with Roman dead. The battle itself defied the expectations that Roman commanders had carried onto the field. Hannibal's center gave way before the Roman advance, exactly as the consuls had anticipated, the legionaries pressing forward with the disciplined aggression that had conquered Italy and defeated every previous enemy. But the retreat was controlled, deliberate, designed to draw the Romans deeper into a formation that slowly curved around their flanks like arms closing for an embrace. When Carthaginian cavalry completed the encirclement, the trap became a killing ground where Roman soldiers died in numbers that beggared comprehension. Young Scipio survived through fortune and perhaps through the instincts that combat had developed over 2 years of education in warfare's harshest school. He found himself among the remnants that gathered at Canusium as night fell on a field where 50,000 of their countrymen lay dead or dying. The scope of the disaster exceeded anything Roman history recorded, its implications threatening not merely military setback, but the dissolution of the alliances that had made Rome master of Italy. What happened at Canusium in the hours following the battle would mark Scipio as surely as his rescue of his father had marked him 2 years before. Some among the surviving nobles, young men from families as distinguished as his own, spoke of abandoning Italy entirely, of taking ship for Spain or Sicily, or wherever Roman refugees might find safety from the catastrophe Hannibal had inflicted. Flight seemed reasonable to men who had watched their world collapse in a single afternoon. Scipio's response became legendary in the telling, though accounts varied regarding exact words and circumstances. He confronted the would-be refugees with drawn sword, demanding oaths of continued loyalty to Rome on pain of immediate death. The young man who had charged through Numidian cavalry to save his father now charged through despair to save his country's honor. Those who had contemplated flight swore instead to continue fighting, their oaths binding them to resistance that would eventually prove justified. The years following Cannae tested Roman resilience as nothing had tested it before. Hannibal marched through southern Italy, his army welcomed by communities that believed Rome's power broken beyond recovery. Syracuse defected to Carthage. Philip of Macedon allied himself with the apparent victor, and the network of relationships that had made Rome supreme in Italy frayed at countless points. Yet the core held. The Latin allies remained loyal, the northern Italian communities maintained their allegiance, and Rome itself refused to consider the negotiations that Hannibal's victories should have made inevitable. Young Scipio's service continued through these desperate years, his responsibilities growing as the pool of experienced officers shrank through casualties that the Republic could barely replace. He sought and won election as curule aedile, despite being technically too young for the office, his response to objections carrying the confidence that Canusium had crystallized. If the people wished to elect him, he was old enough. The voters agreed, their choice reflecting recognition that extraordinary times required extraordinary measures. His father and uncle had taken the war to Spain, their campaigns seeking to sever the reinforcement pipeline that connected Carthage's Iberian territories to Hannibal's forces in Italy. For years they fought with the skill that Scipio blood seemed to guarantee, their victories preventing the concentration of Carthaginian resources that might have made Hannibal's position unassailable. The young aedile in Rome followed their campaigns with the attention of a son and nephew whose own military education had been conducted in the shadow of their achievements. The news that arrived in 211 BIE struck the Scipio household with the force of a physical blow. Both commanders had fallen in Spain within weeks of each other, their armies scattered, their gains erased, their deaths leaving Roman strategy in the peninsula without direction or leadership. The territories they had won contracted toward the Ebro River, Carthaginian forces recovering positions that years of campaigning had wrested from their control. Rome faced a decision that its remaining commanders seemed reluctant to address. Spain required leadership that could rebuild shattered armies and resume offensive operations against enemies who had proven their capability to defeat Scipio generals. The assignment offered more risk than glory, its dangers evident in the fates of the men who had previously held it. Qualified candidates found reasons to decline consideration for a command that seemed more likely to produce another funeral than another triumph. Young Publius Cornelius Scipio stepped forward with a proposal that must have seemed audacious to the point of absurdity. At 25, he had never held independent command. His highest office remained the aedileship, a position concerned with games and public buildings rather than military operations. His primary qualifications appeared to be his family name and his survival of battles that had killed better men. Yet he volunteered to take command in Spain, to avenge his father and uncle, to succeed where they had failed. The assembly that granted him proconsular imperium the authority to command Roman forces as if he held the consulship, made a decision that violated every precedent governing Roman military appointments. No one so young had ever received such responsibility. No one with so little experience had ever been entrusted with armies, operating at such distance from Rome's direct supervision. The choice represented either inspiration or desperation, and only time would reveal which. The young commander, who sailed for Spain in 210 BC, carried with him the weight of expectations that would have crushed most men, and the memory of lessons that disasters had taught. He had watched Hannibal defeat every Roman general who faced him, had studied the tactics that produced those victories, had survived battles that killed tens of thousands of his countrymen. Now he would apply what he had learned in a theatre, where failure meant not merely personal disgrace, but the perpetuation of a war that was slowly bleeding Rome toward exhaustion. The Mediterranean stretched before his ships, its waters connecting the Italy he was leaving to the Spain he was approaching. The same sea that Carthaginian vessels crossed carrying the supplies and reinforcements that sustained Hannibal's campaigns. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay the proving ground where a young man's theories about warfare would meet the test of reality, where the lessons of Ticinus and Trebia and Trasimene and Cannae would either produce victory or add another Scipio to the list of commanders who had underestimated Carthaginian capabilities. The Spanish coast rose from the sea as his fleet approached, its hills hiding enemies who had already killed his father and uncle, its cities holding resources that both sides needed to continue the war. Young Scipio studied that coastline with eyes that had witnessed more defeat than any Roman of his generation should have had to endure. He was sailing toward either vindication or disaster, and the next years would determine not just his own fate, but the future of the war that had already consumed so much of his youth. Spain revealed itself to the young commander as a land of stark contrasts and hidden possibilities. Rivers carved through highlands where silver deposits had drawn Carthaginian interest generations before, their waters flowing toward coasts where ancient trading cities controlled commerce that enriched whoever held them. The interior stretched in plateaus and mountain ranges that could swallow armies whole, its peoples divided into tribes whose loyalties shifted with calculations that outsiders found difficult to predict. Scipio established his headquarters at Tarraco, the Roman stronghold north of the Ebro that had survived the disasters consuming his father's and uncle's commands. Here he found remnants of armies that defeat had demoralized but not destroyed, veterans whose experience of Spanish warfare exceeded anything his Italian campaigns had provided. He spent the winter months of 210 to 209 BC learning what these men could teach, while they assessed the young commander whose family name had brought him authority his years had not yet earned. The strategic situation he inherited offered few obvious paths forward. 3 Carthaginian armies operated in Spain under separate commands. Hasdrubal Barca, Hannibal's brother, held the central territories. Mago Barca commanded in the west. Hasdrubal Gisco controlled the south. Their combined forces substantially outnumbered the Roman troops available, their positions blocking any direct advance toward the rich southern regions where Carthaginian power centered. Previous Roman commanders had attempted to defeat these armies in detail, a strategy that had produced initial successes, followed by the catastrophic reversal that orphaned young Scipio. The plan that formed in the new commander's mind displayed the unconventional thinking that would characterize his entire career. Rather than engaging the enemy armies directly, he would strike at the source of Carthaginian power in Spain, New Carthage itself. The city Hamilcar Barca had founded as the capital of Carthaginian Iberia. This port held the treasury that paid Carthaginian soldiers, the arsenals that equipped them, the hostages whose detention ensured the loyalty of Spanish tribes. Its capture would transform the strategic balance more decisively than any battlefield victory. The audacity of the concept matched the precision of its execution. Scipio gathered intelligence about New Carthage with the thoroughness of a commander who understood that knowledge preceded successful action. He learned that the city's garrison numbered only 1,000 men, its Carthaginian commanders confident that distance from Roman positions made reinforcement unnecessary. He discovered that a lagoon protecting the city's northern wall became fordable at low tide, a phenomenon the defenders apparently discounted as a threat. He calculated marching times, studied seasonal patterns, and developed plans that accounted for variables other commanders might have overlooked. The Roman army moved south in the spring of 209 BC with a speed that Carthaginian intelligence networks failed to anticipate. Scipio drove his forces along coastal routes at a pace that covered the distance to New Carthage before any of the three enemy armies could respond. 7 days of forced marching delivered him to the walls of a city whose defenders suddenly faced assault without any prospect of relief. The attack began conventionally enough, Roman forces pressing against walls that the garrison defended with the desperation of men who understood what capture would mean. Ladders rose against fortifications that had been designed to resist exactly such assaults, their defenders hurling down missiles that made each attempted escalade costly. The fighting continued through hours that seemed to confirm the city's impregnability, Roman casualties mounting without corresponding progress toward the breakthrough that victory required. Then the tide turned, literally. As waters receded from the lagoon during the afternoon ebb, Scipio led a picked force across the exposed mudflats toward walls that the defenders had left lightly manned. The phenomenon that local fishermen considered ordinary appeared miraculous to soldiers who watched their commander wade through shallows where deep water had flowed hours before. Ladders rose against the northern wall, while defenders rushed to meet a threat they had not anticipated, their redeployment weakening positions where Roman pressure had not relented. New Carthage fell before sunset, its capture accomplished with losses that the strategic gains made negligible. The treasury yielded funds that would finance years of campaigning. The arsenals provided weapons and materials that Roman supply lines would have struggled to deliver. Most valuable of all, the hostages held in the city, children and relatives of Spanish tribal leaders, now became instruments of Roman diplomacy rather than Carthaginian coercion. Scipio's treatment of these hostages announced a style of conquest that distinguished his approach from the harsh precedents Roman commanders typically established. Rather than holding them as guarantees of continued submission, he released them to their families with gifts and assurances of Roman friendship. The gesture cost little in material terms, while generating goodwill that no amount of military pressure could have compelled. Tribal leaders who had served Carthage from fear now considered whether Roman alliance might serve their interests better. One episode from the city's capture illustrated the character that Scipio was developing into something approaching legend. Among the prisoners was a young woman of exceptional beauty, whose captors brought her before the commander, expecting reward for such a prize. Scipio learned that she was betrothed to a Celtiberian chief named audacious, a young man whose tribe's allegiance remained uncertain. Rather than claiming the woman as the spoils that military custom permitted, Scipio summoned her fiancé and returned her untouched, adding the ransom her family had gathered to the gifts that accompanied her release. Audacious departed with his bride and his gold to become one of Rome's most reliable Spanish allies. his personal gratitude translating into military support that proved valuable in campaigns to come. The story spread through Spanish territories with the speed that remarkable generosity always travels, its message clear to tribal leaders weighing their options. This Roman commander offered partnership rather than mere domination. His word could be trusted. His character matched his capabilities. The capture of New Carthage transformed Scipio from promising young commander into a figure whose reputation began approaching the mythic. He encouraged this perception through careful attention to the religious dimensions of leadership that Roman tradition emphasized. His habit of visiting Jupiter's temple before major decisions, his references to dreams and divine guidance, his apparent confidence that the gods favored his enterprises. These behaviors cultivated an image of special destiny that motivated followers and unsettled enemies. The Carthaginian commanders in Spain faced a strategic situation that New Carthage's fall had fundamentally altered. Their unified response to the Roman threat might have overwhelmed Scipio's forces, but the jealousies and suspicions that divided them prevented the coordination that numbers alone could not guarantee. Hasdrubal Barca moved first, his army encountering Scipio's forces at Baecula in 208 BC in an engagement that demonstrated how thoroughly the young Roman had absorbed the lessons Hannibal's victories had taught. The battle unfolded across terrain that Hasdrubal had chosen for its defensive advantages, his forces positioned on high ground that Roman assault would have to climb under missile fire. Scipio refused the frontal attack that his enemy expected, instead sending forces around both flanks while a holding force fixed Carthaginian attention on the center. The maneuver replicated in miniature the encirclement that Hannibal had achieved at Cannae, though the terrain prevented the complete annihilation that the Italian battle had produced. Hasdrubal escaped with enough of his army to remain a threat, but his escape route led not toward renewed confrontation with Scipio, but toward the Alpine passes his brother had crossed years before. The Carthaginian high command had decided that reinforcing Hannibal in Italy took priority over defending Spanish positions that seemed increasingly untenable. Hasdrubal's march northward removed one of the three armies that had faced Scipio, while confirming that Roman strategy in Spain was achieving its fundamental objective, preventing resources from reaching Hannibal. The following years saw Scipio systematically dismantling Carthaginian power throughout the peninsula. Spanish tribes that had supported Carthage from calculation or coercion reassessed their positions as Roman military success combined with diplomatic generosity to alter the balance of advantages. Cities that had served as Carthaginian strongholds negotiated surrenders that Scipio's reputation for fair treatment made less terrifying than resistance unto destruction. Ilipa in 206 BC provided the culminating demonstration of Scipio's military maturity. The Carthaginian forces that remained in Spain concentrated under Hasdrubal Gisco and Mago for a final effort to reverse the deteriorating situation. Their armies substantially outnumbered the Roman forces Scipio could assemble, their position chosen to maximize advantages that superior numbers should provide. Scipio approached the confrontation with the methodical preparation that characterized his most successful operations. For several days before the battle, he deployed his forces in consistent formations, Roman legions in the center, Spanish allies on the wings, establishing patterns that his enemies observed and expected to continue. The Carthaginians arranged their own forces in mirror image, their best African troops in the center facing the Roman legions they anticipated would oppose them. On the morning of battle, Scipio reversed everything. His army advanced before dawn, catching the Carthaginian forces unprepared and unfed. The formations that had seemed fixed now shifted. Spanish allies held the center, while Roman legions deployed on the wings, the strongest troops positioned to strike where the enemy was weakest. The Carthaginian commanders, committed to dispositions designed for a different battle, found themselves unable to adjust before Scipio's wings crushed their flanks and rolled up their line. The victory at Ilipa effectively ended Carthaginian power in Spain. Mago sailed for Italy with the remnants he could extract, his departure leaving no organized Carthaginian force in a peninsula that his family had spent decades conquering. The silver mines that had funded Carthaginian armies now enriched Roman treasuries. The Spanish warriors who had filled Carthaginian ranks now offered their services to a commander whose success suggested that Roman victory in the broader war was merely a matter of time. Scipio crossed briefly to Africa before returning to Rome, his visit to the Numidian king Syphax, combining military reconnaissance with diplomatic exploration. The African coastline that he surveyed from Syphax's territory would become his next theatre of operations, though the political arrangements necessary to carry the war across the Mediterranean remained to be secured. He had seen enough to know that the path to final victory led through Carthage itself, that the war would end only when Roman forces threatened the enemy's homeland, as Hannibal's forces had threatened Rome. The commander who sailed back toward Italy in 206 BC bore little resemblance to the youth who had ridden north with his father 8 years before. He had proven himself against enemies who had destroyed better armies than his own, developed strategies that turned Hannibal's tactics against Carthaginian forces, built alliances through generosity that harsh domination could never have secured. Spain had been his education, its campaigns, his examination, its conquest, his qualification for the greater challenges that awaited. Rome received him with honors that reflected achievements exceeding anything his youth should have permitted. He had avenged his father and uncle, recovered territories their deaths had lost, eliminated an entire theatre of Carthaginian operations. The silver and gold that accompanied his return demonstrated that victory could be profitable as well as glorious. The Spanish warriors who had followed him home showed that Rome could attract loyalty that transcended mere submission. Yet Hannibal remained in Italy, his army undefeated, his presence a constant reminder that the war's fundamental challenge had not been met. Scipio understood that Spanish victories, however impressive, could not end a conflict that continued as long as Carthage's greatest general operated on Italian soil. The strategy that would force Hannibal's withdrawal was already forming in his mind. The same strategy he had glimpsed during his visit to Syphax's kingdom. The same strategy that cautious minds in Rome would resist with every argument tradition could provide. The Senate awaited his return with the mixture of gratitude and suspicion that successful commanders always inspired in republican institutions. Scipio had accomplished what he had promised, but his methods and his manner raised questions that political rivals would exploit. The campaign for Africa that he envisioned would require persuading men whose caution had been reinforced by years of disaster, whose instincts favored defensive strategies over the offensive operations that his plan demanded. The battles ahead would be fought in the Senate as well as on the field, their outcomes no less crucial for being conducted with words rather than weapons. The city that welcomed Scipio home had changed in ways both visible and subtle since he had departed for Spain. Temples built to honor gods whose favor Rome desperately needed rose alongside monuments commemorating victories that seemed distant memories against the backdrop of continuing Italian occupation. The streets still functioned, the markets still operated, the rhythms of urban life continued despite Hannibal's presence in the south. But an exhaustion had settled over the Republic that no amount of Spanish silver could entirely dispel. Scipio entered Rome not in triumph, for that honor required specific conditions his Spanish command had not technically satisfied, but with a reputation that triumph itself could hardly have enhanced. The young commander, who had sailed west with an unprecedented appointment, returned as the most successful Roman general of a war that had produced precious few successes. His name circulated through every level of society, his achievements discussed in Senate chambers and tavern conversations with equal enthusiasm. The consulship awaited him as the natural next step in a career that had already shattered precedents governing normal advancement. He won election for the year 205 BC with support that crossed factional lines, the voters recognizing that whatever concerns his rapid rise might inspire, the Republic needed his capabilities too desperately to impose artificial obstacles. At 31 years of age, he assumed the office his father had held when Hannibal descended from the Alps, the symmetry suggesting patterns that Romans inclined towards seeing divine intention in human affairs could not ignore. The strategy Scipio proposed to his fellow senators struck many as dangerously close to madness. Rather than continuing the grinding defensive warfare that had prevented Hannibal from achieving his objectives without actually defeating him, Scipio urged carrying the war to Africa itself. An invasion of Carthaginian home territory would force the enemy to recall armies operating abroad, ending the Italian occupation, not through direct confrontation, but through threat to interests Carthage valued more than distant conquests. The logic seemed sound to those willing to consider it without prejudice. Hannibal's strength in Italy derived from his army's isolation, cut off from reinforcement after Hasdrubal's defeat, dependent on whatever support wavering Italian allies might provide, unable to replace casualties that steady attrition inflicted. Yet his presence continued tying down Roman forces that might be employed more profitably elsewhere. The strategic situation resembled a knot that direct pulling only tightened. Scipio proposed cutting it entirely by shifting the war to a theatre where Rome held advantages that Italy denied. Fabius Maximus rose in opposition with the authority that decades of service and the dictatorship itself had accumulated. The old general, whose delaying strategy had preserved Rome through its darkest hours, now argued that Scipio's proposal risked everything his caution had saved. An African expedition would divide Roman forces, while Hannibal remained undefeated on Italian soil. Supply lines stretching across the Mediterranean would prove vulnerable to interruption. The fate of Regulus in the previous war, initial success followed by catastrophic defeat and personal humiliation, demonstrated the dangers that African campaigns presented. The debate that followed exposed divisions within the Roman leadership that transcended mere strategic disagreement. Fabius represented an older generation whose formative experiences had taught that survival took precedence over glory, that patience constituted virtue rather than weakness, that innovations in strategy were as likely to produce disaster as triumph. Scipio embodied something new, a confidence born from victories that his elders had never achieved, a willingness to accept risks that caution could never eliminate entirely, an understanding of Carthaginian weakness that defensive postures could not exploit. Senators who had watched Roman strategy produce stalemate at enormous cost in lives and treasure found Scipio's arguments compelling even when his manner gave them pause. The young consul projected certainty that some found inspiring and others found presumptuous. His references to divine favor and personal destiny suggesting self-regard that republican traditions viewed with suspicion. Yet his results in Spain could not be dismissed. His understanding of the enemy could not be questioned, and his proposal offered something that years of cautious defense had failed to provide: a path toward actually ending the war. The compromise that emerged reflected the Senate's ambivalence about both the proposal and the man proposing it. Scipio received Sicily as his province, with permission to cross to Africa if he judged such action beneficial to the Republic. He would not receive the substantial additional forces that a major invasion might require, the Senate declining to authorize new legions for an enterprise whose wisdom remained disputed. If he wished to invade Africa, he would have to do so with the forces already in Sicily, supplemented by whatever volunteers he could attract. The limitations might have discouraged a commander less confident in his abilities and less creative in addressing obstacles. Scipio recognized that the restrictions actually freed him to build the kind of army his strategy required. The legions stationed in Sicily included survivors of Cannae, men who had been consigned to service without discharge or reward as punishment for their participation in that disaster. These soldiers had spent years in a military exile that denied them the honor their republic usually accorded its veterans. Scipio offered the Cannae survivors something more valuable than the discharge they had been promised and denied. He offered redemption. Service in his African campaign would erase the disgrace that defeat had imposed, would restore the status that Roman soldiers valued alongside material rewards, would prove that the disaster 8 years before had reflected their commander's failures rather than their own. The response exceeded anything voluntary recruitment usually produced. Desperate men embracing an opportunity to reclaim what Hannibal had taken from them on that terrible August day. Volunteers from throughout Italy supplemented the Sicilian legions as word spread that Scipio was accepting soldiers for the African expedition. Veterans whose service had ended found reasons to return to the standards. Young men eager for glory, that Italian garrison duty would never provide sought places in an army whose destination promised adventure their father's generation had never known. The force that assembled around Scipio reflected his personal appeal as much as official authorization, its loyalty directed toward its commander rather than the institutions that had grudgingly permitted his enterprise. Sicily provided the staging ground where Scipio transformed these disparate elements into the instrument his strategy required. The island's resources supported intensive training that welded volunteers and veterans into cohesive units capable of the coordinated operations African warfare would demand. Naval forces gathered in harbors where shipwrights prepared transports sufficient to carry an army across waters that Carthaginian fleets still contested. The months of preparation gave Scipio time to refine plans that Spanish reconnaissance had sketched, and intelligence from multiple sources had elaborated. The spring of 204 BC brought weather suitable for the crossing that Sicily's harbors had spent the winter preparing. Approximately 400 transports and 40 warships assembled for an expedition carrying perhaps 35,000 soldiers toward a hostile shore. The fleet that departed Sicilian waters represented years of strategic argument, condensed into wooden hulls and bronze rams, its course set toward either vindication or catastrophe, depending on outcomes that no planning could guarantee. The Mediterranean stretched calm beneath skies that seemed to bless the enterprise with favorable conditions. Soldiers who had never sailed beyond sight of land watched Italian coastlines fade into haze, while African shores remained hidden beyond horizons that seemed to retreat as quickly as the fleet advanced. The voyage lasted days that blurred together in the monotony of shipboard routine, the only variety provided by dolphins accompanying the vessels and occasional adjustments of sail and oar as winds shifted. Scipio used the crossing to review intelligence about conditions awaiting his forces. Carthage itself remained too strongly fortified for direct assault, its walls and garrison capable of resisting anything short of prolonged siege that his army could not sustain. The surrounding countryside offered better prospects, wealthy agricultural territories, whose devastation would threaten Carthaginian prosperity, allied cities whose loyalty might prove more negotiable than their metropolis could accept, and political divisions within the Carthaginian elite that skillful diplomacy might exploit. The Numidian situation had evolved since Scipio's reconnaissance visit years before. Syphax, the king he had courted, had married Sophonisba, daughter of Hasdrubal Gisco, her beauty and Carthaginian diplomacy accomplishing what Roman overtures had failed to prevent. The western Numidian kingdom now supported Carthage, its cavalry, the finest light horsemen the ancient world produced, available to oppose rather than assist Roman operations. Yet Syphax's rival, Massinissa, offered compensation for this diplomatic reverse. This prince of the eastern Numidian Massili had been displaced by Syphax's expansion, and now wandered with a small following, seeking opportunities for restoration. His knowledge of Numidian warfare, his claim to territories that might rally to his cause, and his burning resentment of the arrangement that had transferred both kingdom and intended bride to his rival, made him a natural ally for Roman forces, whose success would advance his own interests. The African coast materialized from morning haze as the fleet approached its destination, the shoreline revealing itself in stages that transformed abstract strategy into concrete geography. Soldiers crowded the rails of transport ships, their eyes searching for signs of the opposition their landing might encounter, their hands checking weapons that the voyage had given them ample time to prepare. The beaches that received them lay quiet, Carthaginian forces having withdrawn, rather than contest a landing they could not prevent. The camp that Roman engineers constructed in the hours following disembarkation announced permanence that raids would not have required. Trenches and palisades rose according to patterns that legions had followed since the Republic's earliest days, their regularity proclaiming that this army had come to stay. Scipio established his headquarters within walls that would serve as the base for operations extending across territories whose inhabitants were about to discover what Roman invasion meant. Carthage learned of the landing with alarm that exceeded anything Hannibal's Italian victories had inspired in Rome. The city's own territory now faced the devastation that distant allies had suffered for years, its citizens confronting the prospect of siege and destruction that comfortable distance had previously made theoretical. The debate between those who urged negotiation and those who demanded resistance intensified as Roman forces began demonstrating capabilities that diplomatic warnings had failed to convey. The campaign that unfolded through the following months combined military pressure with political manipulation in patterns that Scipio's Spanish experience had perfected. Raids destroyed agricultural wealth that Carthaginian prosperity required. Each burned granary and confiscated herd, reducing the resources available for continued resistance. Approaches to potential allies probed for weaknesses in the coalition that geography and marriage had assembled against Roman interests. Scipio had brought the war to Africa as he had promised. The gamble that cautious senators had warned against was now reality, its outcome dependent on factors that preparation could influence but not control. The Cannae survivors who had followed him seeking redemption would find their opportunity in the campaigns ahead. The young consul, whose confidence had overcome senatorial resistance, would discover whether that confidence was justified. And Carthage, which had sent Hannibal to threaten Rome's existence, now faced a Roman commander whose presence threatened its own. The African sun set over a landscape that Roman soldiers were learning to navigate, its warmth lingering into evenings when campfires dotted positions that no Roman army had occupied in nearly 50 years. Somewhere in Italy, Hannibal continued the occupation that Scipio's strategy was designed to end. Somewhere in Carthage, councils debated responses to a threat that grew more pressing with each passing day. And in the Roman camp, a commander who had survived Cannae and conquered Spain contemplated the moves that would determine whether his audacious gamble would produce the victory he had promised or the disaster his opponents had predicted. The Carthaginian countryside unfolded before Roman reconnaissance parties in colours that seemed almost too vivid for soldiers accustomed to Italian landscapes. Golden wheat rippled across plains where generations of careful cultivation had transformed African soil into prosperity that now invited destruction. Olive groves planted by great-grandfathers of men, currently debating in Carthage's council chambers, offered shade to Roman scouts, assessing which estates might yield the most valuable plunder. The wealth that Roman raids targeted represented centuries of accumulated investment, each burned farmhouse a message that distance no longer protected Carthaginian interests from Roman consequences. Scipio conducted these operations with the strategic patience that his Spanish campaigns had refined. Devastation served purposes beyond mere destruction. It demonstrated Roman capabilities to populations whose loyalty Carthage could not take for granted. Pressured political factions inclined toward negotiation, and accumulated resources that sustained an army operating far from secure supply lines. The systematic nature of Roman raiding announced that this invasion represented something more serious than the temporary incursions previous wars had witnessed. Utica became the initial focus of Roman siege operations, its position offering harbour facilities that would ease the logistical challenges naval supply across the Mediterranean created. The city's walls proved more formidable than quick assault could overcome, its garrison reinforced by the knowledge that Carthaginian relief forces were assembling. Scipio settled into siege routines, while monitoring developments that would determine whether investment of this single city served larger strategic purposes or merely fixed his forces in positions that concentrated enemies might overwhelm. Massinissa arrived at the Roman camp with a following that his misfortunes had reduced to insignificance. Perhaps 200 horsemen, whose loyalty reflected personal attachment rather than any realistic assessment of their prince's prospects. The Numidian who presented himself to Scipio bore little resemblance to the powerful ally that strategic planning had anticipated. His kingdom had been lost to Syphax, his intended bride married to his rival, his future dependent entirely on whether Roman success might restore what Carthaginian diplomacy had stripped away. Yet Scipio recognized in this diminished prince precisely the qualities his campaign required. Massinissa knew Numidian warfare with the intimacy that only lifelong practice could provide. His hatred of Syphax guaranteed commitment that mere alliance could never secure. His claim to the Massili throne offered legitimacy that successful Roman operations might transform from empty assertion into political reality. The partnership that formed between Roman commander and Numidian exile would prove more valuable than the thousands of cavalry that Syphax's defection had cost. The enemy concentration that winter revealed posed threats that even Scipio's confidence could not dismiss lightly. Syphax brought Numidian cavalry in numbers that dwarfed anything Massinissa could provide, his horsemen representing the mobile striking power that had proven decisive in so many of the war's earlier battles. Hasdrubal Gisco commanded Carthaginian forces whose quality reflected desperate measures the invasion had inspired. Together they assembled an army that substantially outnumbered Scipio's expeditionary force. their camps established close enough to the Roman siege lines to threaten intervention whenever opportunity presented. Negotiations provided cover for preparations that Scipio conducted with characteristic thoroughness. Embassies passed between the camps, carrying proposals and counter-proposals, whose content mattered less than the access they provided. Roman officers accompanying these diplomatic missions observed enemy dispositions with the careful attention that planning required, their reports informing operations that negotiation was designed to mask rather than prevent. The camps that Syphax and Hasdrubal had constructed followed patterns that emphasized comfort over security, their forces expecting that ongoing negotiations precluded sudden attack. Reed and wooden structures housed soldiers whose vigilance had relaxed during weeks of diplomatic exchange. The layout that Roman observers had memorized offered vulnerabilities that quick, coordinated assault might exploit before defenders could organize effective resistance. Scipio struck on a night when darkness and wind combined to favor the attackers he had prepared. Roman forces advanced in columns, whose routes reconnaissance had established, their approach concealed by conditions that also fed the flames they were about to kindle. The first fires caught in Syphax's camp, their spread through combustible structures, accelerating faster than panicked soldiers could counter. Men who had been sleeping moments before now fled burning shelters into darkness where Roman weapons waited. Hasdrubal's camp erupted next, its soldiers rushing toward the flames they assumed represented accident rather than attack. The confusion that resulted exceeded anything direct assault could have achieved. Thousands of enemy soldiers dying in fires or falling to Roman blades while attempting to comprehend a catastrophe that unfolded faster than understanding could develop. By dawn, the army that had threatened to overwhelm Scipio's siege had largely ceased to exist as a fighting force. The destruction of the enemy camps transformed the strategic situation more decisively than any conventional battle could have accomplished. Syphax fled toward his kingdom, with remnants too demoralized to offer further resistance. Hasdrubal retreated toward Carthage to report disaster and organize whatever response shattered resources might permit. The siege of Utica, which had seemed increasingly precarious as enemy forces concentrated, could now continue without immediate threat of relief. Carthage's response to catastrophe demonstrated the resilience that had sustained the city through centuries of Mediterranean competition. New levies filled gaps that the burning camps had created, their training accelerated by necessity that peacetime standards would never have permitted. Syphax rallied Numidian forces, whose tribal loyalties transcended the personal disasters their king had suffered. Within weeks, another army had assembled to contest Roman operations that the First Army's destruction had failed to prevent. The Battle of the Great Plains in 203 BC provided Scipio the opportunity to demonstrate that his success owed nothing to luck or surprise alone. The Carthaginian and Numidian forces that faced him across open ground had been warned by previous disaster to expect Roman capabilities that comfortable assumptions had obscured. Their deployment reflected lessons that burning camps had taught, their vigilance maintained at levels that night attacks could not exploit. Scipio met them with tactical arrangements that Spanish battles had perfected. His Roman infantry held the center, while cavalry, Massinissa's Numidians, supplemented by Italian horsemen, threatened flanks that Carthaginian dispositions had left vulnerable. The battle developed through phases that Scipio's veterans had learned to execute with precision that newer enemy formations could not match. Each Roman maneuver answered by responses that arrived too slowly to prevent the disadvantages patient pressure created. The Carthaginian center broke first, its newly raised levies unable to sustain resistance that veteran legions applied with relentless pressure. Syphax's Numidians, deprived of infantry support that retreat had removed, found themselves isolated against cavalry whose commander knew their tactics intimately. The pursuit that followed scattered enemy forces across landscapes where Roman and allied horsemen hunted fugitives until exhaustion forced pause. Syphax himself fell captive to Massinissa's forces, his capture completing a reversal of fortune that must have seemed impossible when he had commanded the coalition that threatened to drive Scipio into the sea. The king, who had married Sophonisba and allied with Carthage, now travelled toward the Roman camp as a prisoner whose fate would serve Roman purposes more effectively than his death could have accomplished. The circumstances surrounding Sophonisba's end illustrated complexities that military victory alone could not resolve. Massinissa, confronting the woman who had been promised to him before Syphax's intervention, claimed her as his bride before Roman authority could determine her disposition. The marriage that followed, conducted with haste that reflected passion, politics, or both, presented Scipio with a dilemma that military success had created rather than prevented. Sophonisba represented dangers that romantic attachment could not neutralize. Her influence had converted Syphax from Roman alliance to Carthaginian partnership. Similar influence over Massinissa might undermine the loyalty that Roman strategy required. Scipio demanded that his Numidian ally surrender the woman to Roman custody, where her status as enemy royalty would be determined by Senate decision rather than battlefield impulse. Massinissa's response preserved both his honor and Roman requirements through a solution that satisfied no one while resolving the immediate crisis. He sent Sophonisba poison rather than surrender her to captivity that both understood would end in public humiliation. She accepted the gift with the dignity that her situation permitted, her death removing a complication that her life would have perpetuated. The episode revealed tensions within the Roman-Numidian alliance that victory had not eliminated, though shared interests proved sufficient to sustain cooperation despite personal grievances. Mago's death removed another factor from calculations that both sides were conducting with increasing urgency. Hannibal's brother had sailed from Spain after Ilipa's defeat, his forces landing in northern Italy, where Gallic allies might provide the support that 15 years of warfare had depleted elsewhere. Wounded in battle against Roman forces blocking his advance, he died during the voyage home that Carthaginian councils had ordered. His army, the last Carthaginian force operating outside Africa, dissolved into irrelevance with his passing. Carthage faced a situation that no amount of improvisation could reverse. Roman forces operated freely across territories whose wealth had funded generations of Mediterranean expansion. Allied cities were calculating whether continued loyalty served their interests better than timely defection. The armies that might have contested Roman superiority had been destroyed, captured, or withdrawn beyond any possibility of intervention. Only one option remained that offered any realistic hope of changing a trajectory that pointed toward unconditional surrender. Hannibal received the recall that 15 years of Italian occupation had never previously required. The general who had crossed the Alps, who had destroyed Roman armies at Trebia and Trasimene and Cannae, who had maintained his forces on enemy soil longer than anyone had thought possible. This legendary commander now sailed home to defend a city whose earlier decisions had sent him forth to attack. The strategic reversal that Scipio had promised skeptical senators was becoming reality, with a completeness that exceeded even optimistic projections. The ships that carried Hannibal's veterans toward Africa crossed paths, perhaps literally, with those carrying news of his departure toward Rome. The Italian occupation that had traumatized a generation of Romans was ending not through the decisive battle that so many had sought and failed to achieve, but through the indirect pressure that Scipio's African campaign had applied. The enemy was leaving, called home by threats that made continued Italian operations pointless. Scipio watched these developments unfold with the satisfaction of a commander whose strategic vision was proving correct, and the awareness that the war's climax still awaited. Hannibal was coming, the general whose victories had shaped Scipio's entire adult life, whose tactics he had studied through years of painful education, whose shadow had fallen across Roman consciousness since that terrible crossing of the Alps. The meeting that history had been preparing since both men were young was finally approaching, its outcome destined to determine not just the war's conclusion, but the future of Mediterranean civilization. The African plains that would host their encounter stretched quiet beneath skies that held no hint of the violence to come. Farmers whose fields had survived Roman raiding continued their eternal rhythms of planting and harvest, their concerns focused on immediate survival, rather than strategic implications their labor could not influence. The great commanders, whose collision would reshape their world, were converging toward a confrontation that both had spent lifetimes preparing to face. Hannibal's return transformed Carthaginian morale with an immediate that no other development could have produced. The general whose name had terrified Roman children for 15 years now walked the streets of the city he had departed as a boy, accompanying his father to Spanish exile. Veterans who had crossed the Alps, who had slaughtered Roman legions at Cannae, who had maintained themselves on enemy soil through years that should have been impossible, now assembled in their homeland for the campaign that would determine whether their sacrifices had meaning or had merely postponed an inevitable conclusion. The army Hannibal gathered reflected both the resources Carthage could still command and the limitations that Roman campaigns had imposed. His Italian veterans formed a core whose quality no contemporary force could match, their experience forged through battles that had made military history. Around this nucleus gathered newly raised levies, whose enthusiasm exceeded their training, Numidian cavalry whose loyalty to Carthage had survived Syphax's capture, and 80 war elephants whose terrifying presence might compensate for deficiencies in other arms. Scipio observed these preparations through intelligence networks that African operations had established, his assessments informing dispositions that the coming battle would test. The Roman commander understood that he faced an opponent whose capabilities exceeded anything his previous victories had required him to overcome. Hannibal had defeated better Roman generals, commanding larger Roman armies in circumstances that should have favored Roman success. Confidence that Spanish achievements had built could not blind Scipio to the magnitude of the challenge approaching. The plains near Zama offered terrain that suited the decisive engagement both commanders sought. Open ground permitted the cavalry operations that would likely prove decisive, while sufficient space allowed infantry formations to deploy without the constraints that broken country imposed. Water sources adequate for the armies involved lay within practical distance. The location served tactical requirements while carrying none of the defensive advantages that might have encouraged one side to avoid the confrontation that strategic necessity demanded. The meeting between the two commanders before battle became legendary in the telling. Though accounts varied regarding words exchanged and atmosphere prevailing, Hannibal requested the conference, his initiative suggesting either hope that negotiation might avoid the risks that battle imposed, or curiosity about the opponent whose African campaign had forced his return. Scipio agreed to meet, his acceptance reflecting either courtesy toward a respected enemy, or confidence that conversation could not alter dispositions that victory required. They faced each other across the small distance that protocol established, Two men whose careers had intertwined since Scipio was a teenager, watching his father fall wounded at the Ticinus. Hannibal had aged during the Italian years, his features weathered by campaigns that had demanded everything human endurance could provide. Scipio presented the composed confidence of a commander who had not yet experienced the defeat his opponent had inflicted on so many of his countrymen. Hannibal spoke first, his words carrying the weight of experience that no Roman could match. He counseled acceptance of terms that would preserve Carthaginian independence while acknowledging the reality that Roman arms had established. Fortune was fickle, he suggested, and the victories that had brought Scipio to this field might reverse themselves as thoroughly as his own Italian triumphs had been undone by African disasters. Peace now would secure gains that continued warfare might forfeit. Scipio's response reflected the calculation that had guided his strategy from its inception. The terms that might have satisfied Rome before his African landing no longer sufficed, given sacrifices that subsequent campaigns had imposed. Carthage had violated earlier agreements when circumstances favored violation. Only terms that removed Carthaginian capacity for future aggression could justify the costs that achieving such terms required. If Hannibal wished to avoid the battle that tomorrow would bring, he must accept conditions that his counsel to Carthage had previously rejected. The conference ended without agreement, both commanders returning to forces that the following day would commit to combat whose outcome neither could guarantee. The night that separated conversation from carnage passed in the quiet activity that armies conducted before battles, whose results would determine fates beyond any individual's control. Soldiers checked equipment, offered prayers to gods whose favor they sought, and contemplated mortality with whatever courage or fear their characters provided. Dawn revealed dispositions that both commanders had refined through careers spent studying the military art. Hannibal placed his elephants before his line, their 80 massive forms presenting a spectacle designed to terrify opponents whose Italian experience had not included such creatures in significant numbers. Behind them, his infantry deployed in 3 lines. Foreign mercenaries first, then Carthaginian levies. Finally, his Italian veterans, whose quality represented his greatest asset and his last reserve. Scipio's arrangements answered the challenges that Hannibal's deployment presented. Rather than the continuous front that Roman formations typically maintained, he ordered his maniples to align in columns with gaps between them, lanes through which elephants might pass without disrupting formations they could not penetrate. His cavalry deployed on the flanks where Massinissa's Numidians and Roman horsemen would face Carthaginian and allied cavalry, whose numbers they approximately matched. The elephants charged first, their drivers urging the great beasts forward against Roman lines that waited with the discipline that training had instilled. Some animals veered away from the noise and missiles that Roman soldiers produced to discourage their approach. Others found the gaps that Scipio's dispositions had created, their passage between maniples carrying them through Roman formations without the disruption that solid lines would have suffered. Skirmishers harassed the confused creatures toward flanks where they endangered Carthaginian cavalry more than Roman infantry. The cavalry engagement that followed proved as decisive as Scipio had anticipated. Massinissa led his Numidians against horsemen, whose tribal loyalties he understood from the inside, his personal command inspiring performance that shattered opposition faster than Carthaginian cavalry could reorganize. On the opposite flank, Roman horsemen achieved similar success against enemies whose morale the elephant disaster had already shaken. Both victorious cavalry forces pursued fleeing opponents away from the infantry battle that would determine the day's ultimate outcome. The infantry lines closed with the measured pace that discipline imposed on men, whose instincts urged either flight or headlong charge. Hannibal's mercenaries met Roman legionaries first, the clash producing the grinding attrition that infantry combat always generated when neither side could quickly break the other. These hired soldiers fought with the desperation of men who understood that defeat meant death, their resistance stubborn enough to cost Roman formations casualties that fresh troops would be needed to replace. The second Carthaginian line advanced as the first wavered, but coordination between the two failed in ways that suggested either accident or design. Mercenaries retreating from Roman pressure found Carthaginian levies blocking their path, rather than supporting their reformation. Fighting erupted between supposed allies as exhausted survivors sought passage through formations whose officers ordered them to stand firm. The confusion that resulted disrupted Carthaginian cohesion, while Roman pressure continued with the relentless persistence that legionary training produced. Hannibal's veterans stood apart from this chaos, their line unbroken, their discipline intact, their experience evident in the calm with which they watched disaster unfold before them. These soldiers had conquered Italian armies that substantially outnumbered them. They would not break simply because lesser troops had failed to match their quality. When the Roman advance finally reached their position, it met resistance that recalled the days when Hannibal's army had seemed invincible. The battle hung, suspended in this final confrontation. Roman legions that had swept away two Carthaginian lines, now facing veterans whose stubbornness matched their own. Neither side could break the other through direct assault. The deadlock threatened to produce the inconclusive result that both commanders had sought to avoid. Casualties mounted as the afternoon progressed, each formation grinding against the other without achieving the breakthrough that victory required. Massiniss's return decided the contest that infantry combat could not resolve. The Numidian cavalry that had pursued defeated enemies now reappeared on the battlefield, their arrival threatening Carthaginian flanks that no reserves remained to protect. Roman horsemen, returning from their own pursuit, completed the encirclement that Hannibal himself had achieved at Cannae. The tactical pattern that had destroyed Roman armies, now destroying the army of the man who had invented it. The veterans who had survived 15 years of Italian campaigning died on African soil within sight of the city they had fought to protect. Their resistance continued until resistance became impossible, their formation holding even as cavalry attacks compressed it toward a center that shrank with each passing moment. Hannibal escaped the destruction that consumed his army, his flight preserving a life that might yet serve Carthaginian interests, even though his army had ceased to exist. The field that evening presented scenes that victorious Romans surveyed with emotions mixing triumph and exhaustion. 20,000 Carthaginian dead testified to the completeness of a victory that had required everything Scipio's forces could provide. Roman casualties, though far lighter, reminded survivors that the margin between victory and defeat had been narrower than the outcome might suggest. The battle that ended the Second Punic War had proven worthy of the conflict it concluded. Carthage sued for peace with the desperation of a city whose final hope had died with Hannibal's army. The terms Scipio imposed reflected the strategic reality that Zama had established beyond any possibility of reversal. 10,000 talents of silver, paid over 50 years, would cripple Carthaginian finances while enriching Roman treasuries. The surrender of all war elephants and all but 10 warships would eliminate the military capabilities that had made Carthage a Mediterranean power. The prohibition against waging war without Roman permission would transform an independent state into something approaching a client kingdom. Hannibal himself counseled acceptance of conditions that pride alone might have rejected. The general who had spent his life fighting Rome now urged his city to acknowledge defeat with the same clear-eyed realism that had made him history's most formidable commander. Carthage would survive, diminished but intact, its commercial capabilities preserved even as its military pretensions ended. The alternative, continued resistance against an enemy whose African army had proven itself unbeatable, offered only the complete destruction that acceptance might prevent. Scipio returned to Rome, bearing peace terms that the Senate ratified with the gratitude of a body exhausted by 17 years of warfare that had threatened the Republic's existence. The young man who had sailed to Spain, seeking to avenge his father and uncle, now returned having accomplished what no Roman before him had achieved. The complete defeat of Carthage and the elimination of the threat that Hannibal had represented since his Alpine crossing had announced Carthaginian ambitions to a horrified Rome. The cognomen Africanus attached itself to his name with the permanence that exceptional achievement warranted. Publius Cornelius Scipio became Scipio Africanus, the geographic designation proclaiming the theatre where his greatest victory had been won. The title would pass to his descendants, marking his family forever with the memory of the general who had ended Rome's most dangerous war. No honor the Republic could bestow seemed excessive for the man who had saved it from an enemy that had come closer to destroying Rome than any foe before or since. The triumph that celebrated his return processed through streets lined with citizens whose relief exceeded any joy that previous victories had inspired. Carthaginian spoils displayed the wealth that African conquest had secured. Prisoners walked in chains that demonstrated Roman dominion over enemies who had once threatened Roman existence. And at the procession's heart, the general whose genius had produced this transformation rode toward the capital, where Jupiter awaited the thanksgiving that victory required. Scipio Africanus stood at the summit of Roman achievement, his reputation unassailable, his influence unmatched, his future seemingly unlimited by any constraint that ordinary ambition might recognize. The boy who had saved his father at the Ticinus, who had rallied survivors at Canusium, who had conquered Spain and invaded Africa and defeated Hannibal himself. This man now embodied Roman virtue in its most complete expression. The years ahead would test whether the qualities that had produced such triumph could navigate the different challenges that peace and politics would present.